It's the real news. I'm Aaron Mate. A disastrous showing in the UK general election has cost the Conservative Party its parliamentary majority. To stay in power, Prime Minister Theresa May will have to join forces with the Democratic Unionist Party. The DUP is a right-wing Christian party that opposes abortion and same-sex marriage. Joining me is Adam Ramsey, UK editor of Open Democracy. Adam, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us. So it's striking that in an election that went left with these huge gains by Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party, to stay in power, the Prime Minister, Theresa May, will have to go right to the DUP.
Absolutely. I mean, welcome to the British election system. And the important thing to remember is the DUP is a Northern Irish party. And most people in the rest of the UK kind of forget Northern Ireland exists. They know almost nothing about its politics and they don't know who the DUP are. So most people in Britain today are waking up to find out that this party they've never heard of is going to have a huge influence over their politics, and horrified to discover that there is this really quite far-right party that is still in the British Parliament because it comes from Northern Ireland.
You know, on that point, isn't there sort of an irony here? Because during the campaign, Theresa May attacked Jeremy Corbyn for his ties to militants from Northern Ireland. But now for her to stay in power, she has to join forces with a party that was founded by the same types of people?
Absolutely. So the important thing to remember is the kind of conflict in Northern Ireland, which ended only in 1997, so 20 years ago. And Jeremy Corbyn was accused throughout the campaign in vicious terms by the right-wing tabloids and by the Conservatives of having historically supported the Irish Republican movement and the IRA specifically, which is the militant, the violent wing of that. The DUP is a party which was founded by people involved in the other side of that conflict, but also essentially terrorists involved in violence during the Civil War in Northern Ireland. And there you find the Conservatives going into coalition, it looks like, or at least government in some way, with a party set up equally by, people with strong links to violent terrorists.
Okay, so let's look at the potential consequences of this likely alliance between the Tories and the DUP. The DUP opposes same-sex marriage. They oppose abortion. What do you think they will try to extract from Theresa May in return for their cooperation? And what do you think the consequences could be of their alliance?
So the important thing to remember is that in March, the Northern Irish Assembly, which normally does a lot of the governing of Northern Ireland, collapsed. And so Northern Ireland is going to be run directly from Westminster, as though it had no state government in the USA. And so the DUP, who'd normally only form one half of that administration, along with the Catholic Republican parties, the constitution there says it has to be joint administration from both sides of the community. They all now have huge influence over how that governance happens. And it means the chances of getting things like a women's right to choose in Northern Ireland or equal marriage are probably off the table. But also significantly, remember, the DUP were very strongly in favour of Brexit, even though Brexit is a disaster for Northern Ireland, because it's the only part of the UK which has a land border with the EU, in other words, with the Republic of Ireland. And one of the biggest issues in Brexit is the nature of that border. So one of the questions is how the DUP will play that. And they haven't been a constructive part of that negotiation so far. They're a kind of hard-right British nationalist party. They love the idea of Brexit and of being severed from Ireland as much as possible. And there's real worry there that, the other side of the community in Northern Ireland, which is represented by Sinn Féin, who don't take their seats in the British Parliament, won't have their voice heard at all.
And that's important, especially because the negotiations over Brexit are due to begin in less than 2 weeks, right?
Absolutely. And the EU has said one of their three major issues in that negotiation will be Ireland. And so the fact that you've got the DUP, which is a sort of, takes a very hard line, particular position, representing a particularly, one half of the community in Northern Ireland, a community which, as I say, only 20 years ago was at civil war, is a real worry.
There's also been worry from the environmentalist community over the inclusion of the DUP because they have some party members, including some who are in Parliament, who deny climate change.
That's essentially their official position. The DUP are, and if you think about the kind of southern far right in the States and the kind of, the often comes from the Scotch-Irish community. Scotch-Irish means Northern Irish, it's what we call Northern Irish. There's very strong cultural and political links between the kind of right of the Republican Party in the States and the DUP. They're very similar parties. And absolutely, they're very strongly climate change denying. And there's a real worry that, that influence on this government can be hugely damaging.
Now, let me ask you about the peace process in Northern Ireland. It's sort of founded on the premise that the British government remain neutral. But if the British government is taking sides with the DUP in a political alliance, does that possibly jeopardize the peace process itself?
Absolutely. It's important to remember the context as well. Already, the Good Friday Agreement was being endangered by the process of Brexit. The Good Friday Agreement, which is what brought peace to Northern Ireland, explicitly talks about the EU, and it works in the context where both the UK and the Republic of Ireland are in the EU, and therefore there's no border between them. You can easily think of yourself as Irish and be in Northern Ireland while it's in the UK. It's what brought peace to Northern Ireland. There was already huge worries about what a border would mean for that peace process, huge questions about polarisation within the community around Brexit, and the Conservative Party, I think very irresponsibly, had been kind of abdicating its responsibility to be neutral in that, and had been running candidates, getting no votes, but running candidates in Northern Irish elections, taking a very, very hard-line unionist position in Northern Ireland. So already we had this irresponsibility, the Brexit as the context for this, and then we had the DUP coming in and potentially having much more influence than you'd expect over the following government. So for Northern Ireland, it's very worrying, and for people across the UK, the idea that this sort of fringe Northern Irish party with close links to paramilitaries and to, basically fascist groups has any influence on the government should be a real worry.
Finally, Adam, let's talk about why the DUP is even in this position, because of the shocking performance of Jeremy Corbyn and Labour. I remember just a few months ago reading even progressive writers in Britain like Owen Jones saying that Corbyn was going to bring disaster, that Labour was in deep trouble. What happened?
I think the interesting kind of question is about the relative power of the institutions of the British state. The British state has been very good at crushing dissent for a very long time. And because of the way that the mainstream media has broken down, because of since the financial crisis, the way people have lost trust in the kind of old institutions of the UK, you've seen these flarings of what you might call kind of political revolt, democratic revolt in Britain. You saw that with the Scottish independence referendum, you might remember in 2014, where everyone said there was no chance that would happen, and then it ended up being quite close. And you've seen that again with Jeremy Corbyn, where people, for very good reason, are very angry with the establishment. The establishment worked very hard to tell them that they hate Jeremy Corbyn. And so those same people who voted for Brexit, another example of a thing we were told could never happen. Those same people who wanted to kick the establishment, many of them turned out to vote for the man who the establishment told them they hated. And the result is that a popular left-wing manifesto, which was a particular turning point, has received millions of votes, much more support than the Labour Party's had for a very long time. And that Corbyn, once his policies were given a fair hearing, because broadcasters during elections can't be as biased as they normally are, once they were given a fair hearing, voters realised they quite liked what he was saying.
Adam Ramsey, UK editor of Open Democracy. Adam, thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on The Real News.